So this lecture is from chapter 6, and it is on some experiments that are related to conformity and obedience that teach us more about conformity and obedience. Let's define conformity. I think we've defined it in another presentation, but let's define it again just as a reminder. Conformity is the overall term for acting differently due to the influence of others. Conformity is not just acting as other people act, it is also being affected by how they act. It is acting or thinking differently from the way you would act and think if you were alone. Thus, conformity is a change in behavior or belief to accord with others. Obedience. Obedience means doing something you wouldn't do otherwise because someone else says you need to or because rules or laws require it. So now that we have a definition of conformity and obedience, let's look further at the concept of norm formation. So let's define that. Norm formation is the process by which individuals in a group establish shared standards of behavior, attitudes, and beliefs that guide how they act and interact with each other. This collective agreement often develops through social influence, discussions they have, repeated behaviors, leading to a sense of conformity among group members. Norms can significantly impact decision-making and individual behavior as people tend to follow the established norms to fit in and maintain social harmony. So an example of that, of following the established norms, would be being quiet in the library. That's just something, that's a norm. That's something that we do to match with everyone else's behavior. Kind of a silly example is you wouldn't stand up on your chair in a restaurant. That's just kind of a norm that we follow to fit in and not be an outcast. So that's norm formation. So how are norms created? Muzafer Sheriff sought to find the answer to this question through the following experiment. Person 1 is placed in a dark room and watches a moving light. He or she is then asked how far the light moves. A guess might possibly be 6 inches. So the next day, person 1 returns to the room, but this time is joined by 2 other people who were also previously in the experiment. So now you have 3 people in the room that have all previously been in the experiment and all made different guesses. One of the new people guesses that the light has only moved 2 inches. Although at first person 1 might disagree and again say 6 inches, Sharif found that eventually all 3 people come to agree on how far the light has moved. Therefore, a norm or a consensus has been formed. The 3 people have influenced each other to come to an agreement. Just a small note, in the experiment, what's very interesting is the light doesn't actually move ever. Participants perceive it as moving due to the autokinetic phenomenon. That phenomenon is where a small spot of light projected onto a screen in a dark room will appear to move, even though it is still. So even though they're guessing 2 inches, 6 inches, whatever, it's actually not moving due to the autokinetic phenomenon. It's a visual illusion. Here are some other types of social norms. A norm that stems from and organizes casual interactions. Norm that structures the difference between right and wrong. A taboo, which is a strong negative norm. Violating it results in extreme disgust. And laws. Laws are simply norms. They're formally inscribed at the state or federal level. We all follow laws because that's what everyone else does, and that's what's expected of us. So Sharif learned that we do tend to conform to others. But why? Be sure to view the PowerPoint entitled Defining Conformity to find some answers to this question. That will give you more information on why we conform. So that's norm formation, that we conform to other people and things, and certain behaviors become the norm and attitudes become the norm, and we all share those. So here's another study on group pressure. Solomon Ash asked, why are we so influenced by others within our group? He attempted to answer this question through the following experiment. So let's say you're seated 6th in a row of 7 people. The other 6 have been planted. The group is asked which line is the same length as the line on the left, which you can see in that picture. Of course, the answer is B, and everyone gives this answer. The trial is then conducted a second time in which all participants answer B again, but during the third trial, the individual in row 1 answers A. The participant in row 2 answers A. The participant in row 3 answers A. At this point, you're wondering if you're seeing things correctly because you're still thinking it's B. When you're asked which line is the same, will you go with what your eyes tell you, B, or what the group says? They're saying A. Ash found that 37% of the participants conformed to the group. In other words, they said A, even though their eyes told them it was B. Although 37% is not a majority, this still seems to be a fairly high number of people who would give in to the group. Simply because other people said A, they say A. Again, even though their eyes see differently. A study of obedience. Obedience, again, means doing something you wouldn't do otherwise because someone else says you need to, or because rules or laws require it. Stanley Milgram asked how obedient will we be to those in positions of authority? And he conducted the following experiment to try and answer that question. So if you'll look at the diagram, follow along with that. As we read more about this experiment, the teacher asked the learner various questions. When the learner answers incorrectly, he or she is given a shock by the teacher. As the learner continues to answer incorrectly, the experimenter urges the teacher to increase the shock level. The teacher is able to hear the learner's fake cries of pain and yet continues to increase the shock level with every wrong answer. Note the experimenter is considered an authority figure. Notice the white coat. I know there's a saying when you go to a doctor's office, the white coat phenomenon, where we're fearful of that, but simply because it's a doctor and that white coat symbolizes that. So we tend to obey what they say. Similar to this example, he found that the teacher would continue to shock the learner even though he could hear cries of pain. And so he knew he was making them hurt. He was just following the authority's order. So what did he find with that experiment? When Milgram conducted the study with 40 men, 20 to 50-year-olds with varying jobs, 26 of them, which is 65%, progressed all the way to 450 volts. In other words, they followed orders to hurt someone. Those who stopped usually did at the 150 volt point when the learner's protestations became more compelling. So it's important to note, however, that this study would no longer be considered ethical to conduct due to the possible psychological damage that could be experienced by the teacher, the person shocking. So even though it would no longer be ethical, it can still teach us a lot about obedience to authority. So what affected the participants' willingness to be obedient? Why were they obedient? Well, the victim's distance. Milgram's participants acted with the greatest obedience and least compassion when the learners could not be seen and could not see the teachers. When the victim was remote and the teachers heard no complaints, nearly all obeyed calmly to the end. The closeness of the authority also affected how much the teachers continued shocking. When Milgram's experimenter gave the commands by telephone, full obedience dropped to 21%. Remember, it was previously 65%. Other studies confirm that when the one making the command is physically close, compliance increases. Another thing is legitimacy of the authority. Might be someone in the scientific community. Remember the white jacket. We tend to consider that an authority, and so we follow what they say. Might be an institutional authority. Perhaps the institutional prestige of Yale University legitimized the Milgram experiment commands. In post-experimental interviews, many participants said that it had not been for Yale's reputation, they would not have obeyed. So those are some reasons that people might follow the authority. So those are three experiments we looked at on conformity and obedience. If you have any questions about those or want to know further details, as always, please let me know.